This is EntreEd Talk, the podcast for entrepreneurial educators by entrepreneurial educators. We are your hosts, Toi Hirschman and
Amber Ravenscroft. This podcast is created by the National Consortium for Entrepreneurship Education, or EntreEd for short. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of EntreEd Talk. We're super excited to be here today with Eric Koester. He's the only two-time Entrepreneurship Professor of the Year at Georgetown University and the founder and CEO of the Creator Institute. Eric is a serial entrepreneur, having raised tens of millions of venture capital from investors, and is a founding partner and served as the managing partner of Next Gen Venture Partners, a seed stage venture fund. Coined the book professor, Eric helps hundreds of people become published authors, podcast hosts, and creators of all types. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
We're excited. I'm ready to dive in, but we like to kick things off because I feel like you've really made your space in the entrepreneurship educator world, but we like to know about how you got to that space. So I was wondering if you could talk about your journey in that process.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a random one. I mean, I think it's funny. Like, I don't think I ever set out to say, hey, listen, I want to be a professor. I want to be a teacher. Like, it wasn't something that was on my radar at all. For me, is pretty accidental. And a lot of it sort of, I would say, is a couple of happy accidents. I was a lawyer for a while, and I got this weird pro bono client called Startup Weekend. And Startup Weekend at the time was two guys who had gone to Boulder, Colorado to meet Andrew Hyde, who'd done the original Startup Weekend idea, which is sort of one of the big kind of hackathon sort of movement, really led that movement in the early, sort of like the late 2000 sort of time frame really started. And Andrew wasn't running it fully. So these two guys decided to sort of like acquire and turn it into a nonprofit. They approached me about helping them, and that sort of changed my whole life. So I've been to 50 or 60 startup weekends and things like that, and just really had some amazing experiences, started companies out of it and these things. Well, that led me to actually meet Steve Blank. And so Steve Blank joined the board with me of Startup Weekend. And so I met Steve, and I really got to know Steve after I had a sort of a startup failure. So I was fired from one of my startups. When you're the founder, there's a really heavy lift to get kicked on. But afterwards, I got, Steve invited me to his ranch, and he has this amazing ranch that, he always tells people was paid for because he sold his last company. And he invited me down there, and we went on this long walk, and I was sort of like lamenting this thing, like, how can they fire me? They don't understand me. And he told me something that I'll never sort of forget. And he said, listen, Eric, the only way you can move on is if you can understand how to develop a framework for what happened to you. And the only way you can do that is to learn how to teach it. And sort of what he was sort of saying in these sort of subtle ways is like, I want you to do some free work for me. But I didn't realize at the time. I was like, oh, okay, great. And so
flattered at first.
I was super flattered. The whole thing I was flattered. I mean, I love Steve. He's become a big friend of mine, a big mentor. But that sort of set me on this crazy journey where Steve was sort of early in the lean startup movement, was trying to launch it. He had some success at universities, but hadn't really quite gotten it into the hands of accelerators and incubators. So I had this period of time where, I was post startup and the next startup. And so I spent about 6 or 7 months with Steve working on this global sort of program where we were teaching lean startup around the world. And so I worked with 60 to 90 different accelerators and incubators to sort of help them adopt some of Steve's methods. And during that time, I got the chance to teach with him at Columbia, at Berkeley. And so then for me, the teaching thing is, well, then I moved to DC following my wife, and I was starting another company. And one day I get this random call from someone at Georgetown who I'd met at a Christmas party saying, hey, would you be interested in teaching? And I was like, you guys realize I would never have gotten into Georgetown. You want me to teach your students? And so that was literally how it all started. They brought me in, I sort of taught this first class, and it just snowballed. I was curious about how to teach it. And as you'll sort of hear, I enjoyed teaching it, but I got super disillusioned about teaching entrepreneurship, which has sort of led me to what I do today. So that's how my full circle happened to where I got to teach at Georgetown and then eventually led me here.
I always love when I get whiplash from the intro question.
That's a big one, right? Yeah,
My favorite part.
So what made you disillusioned about teaching entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and I actually think that it's my biggest critique on entrepreneurship today is that we focus on the wrong thing. I think we focus on the wrong thing that most people get fixated on the idea of startups. Like, how many startups do we create? How many people, what's the company and that sort of stuff. And I think the biggest thing that we miss the fact is that it's really hard to start a company, and the failure rate and just the personal failure tied to it is so high. And so I found myself sort of teaching, an entrepreneurship class to undergrads. And I was, out there teaching all these people and students and like doing all the startup stuff. I was teaching all those sorts of things. And in my head, the metric was about how many people were going on to start and launch a company. And it turned out I was really crappy at it, I guess, if you use the numbers. Like I looked at my numbers, taught like 300 or 400 students after a couple of years. And I had like 3 that had gone on to start companies they were still working on. I was like, what's the point of all this, right? Like we did all this work and all we have now is a grade. Like what was the point there? And so I think that was my big insight. And it's actually been interesting. I started feeling that and really, I actually, to your whiplash question, I quit teaching. I mean, I went to the head of the entrepreneurship program and said, hey, listen, like, I love you, but I'm out. Like, this is not fulfilling for me. Like, there's a lot of other things to do. And the only reason that I'm here today is his response was, no, you can't quit. And I was like, what do you mean I can't quit? Like, I'm not getting, like, there's no money in this sort of thing. Like, what are you talking about? I don't have a contract. He's like, listen, you have a full semester of students that are signed up for it. I don't have anyone to teach the class. You have to teach one more semester. And that was really the thing for me that I sort of had this, we'll call it this sort of like opportunity in the world of entrepreneurship, because I'd been basically given this green light that there were no consequences for what I was going to have to do. I had another semester I had to teach, and like I'd already quit. Like, what were they going to do? Fire me if I screwed it up? And so that was literally where the genesis for me as sort of attacking entrepreneurship differently through this sort of book projects that I launched has come from. It was honestly because I had 3 weeks and I was not going to do the same crappy class again. And I was like, all right, like I'm going to do something different. And so I got 3 weeks. We're wearing sunglasses. Let's go. Was sort of my, sort of the answer that I came to.
Can you maybe dive a little bit into, because we love our educators. Could you maybe dive a little bit into what did you do? What did you change? Like, explain how you did that and what it looks like now?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's interesting, right? Like, it's not uncommon that what happened to me happens to a lot of entrepreneurial educators. Like, you bring in people from the field and they're full of vigor, and the same sort of thing is like, we want to help students. I want to help people. And, there's a big component, to be frank with you, of ego that involves in teaching at the university level. Like, it feels good to stand up in front of people and to tell people you teach at the school, blah, blah, blah. And so I think that like the disillusionment happens consistently though, because people are like, but like students aren't starting companies. I'm giving them all this stuff. Like I'm saying all this smart stuff. Like, don't they realize how magic my words are? And so I think what I sort of stepped back from this and sort of said, all right, like I realized that my goal here was to actually help people do what they wanted to do rather than what I wanted them to do. And that was the first thing I started thinking about. So I went out and interviewed a whole bunch of my students, and I spent that entire, spent the summer talking to them. And I realized a couple things, that most of them didn't really want to start companies yet. Someday they want to have the opportunity to, but really what they want to do is we kind of entangle two things together when we think about ambitious people. We think that what they want to do is start a company, but really what they want to have is they want to have more autonomy and control. That's really what they're looking for. So if you pull those things apart, you don't have to like start a company to have this. Like, to be entrepreneurial, it's not about necessarily starting this, Mark Zuckerberg high growth content. And then I started asking a follow-up question. And I started asking them, like, so who do you admire? And again, I'm talking about people who are MBAs and undergrads, who do they really look up to? This is another big thing. And I think for any of the educators watching this today, I will tell you that if you don't really know your students and you don't really understand what they care about, you're missing the whole boat. Because so many of the entrepreneurship educators I talk to think that their kids want to be Mark Zuckerberg, they want to be Larry Page, they want these things. They don't anymore. They're past that. They're beyond the idea of wanting to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. They don't care about that anymore. I mean, some do, but that's not the vast majority of them. Who they want to be? They want to be Gary Vaynerchuk. They want to be Brene Brown. They want to be Angela Duckworth. They want to be Hassan Minhaj. They want to be sort of, Tim Ferriss. They want to be sort of Lewis Howes. Those are the people they want to be. And so what's interesting about it was when you realize, like, that ain't starting companies in the way that we think about sort of high growth sort of companies. So I had all this context that was going on around me, realizing like I was teaching for me what I thought was interesting versus what they want to do. So I did customer discovery is the very first thing that I sort of did, right? And I said, all right, great. So then I started to think about that a lot. And I was like, all right, well, so if my goal is to help them leave an autonomous, fulfilled life, what can I do? And so I started talking to friends of mine. I started to think about my own life. And I realized, like, it wasn't for me starting companies that was the thing. There was some precursor that happened. And so I looked back at my own life. And when I was in my 20s, I had this really unique opportunity to write and publish 2 books. Randomness happened, like all these sorts of things happened, but it was crazy. Like the fact that I was a 20-something published author was weird. And what I remember about it so vividly was the 2 things that changed for me. Number one, people perceived me radically different. Like there was this change, and I was, a young guy, but suddenly I was asked to serve on boards. I was like, why are you asking me? Like, I don't know anything. I haven't been doing this forever. And the second thing that happened is I saw myself differently. Suddenly I thought to myself, well, I should be serving on boards, right? This weird sort of dynamic happened. And so the mindset shift that was happened, and that's the thing, that was the sort of the primordial soup that then led me to start companies. And so I realized to myself, like what was happening to me was I had this thing that I now call for my research, what's called a creation event. And what's interesting now is I've studied lots and lots of people who are very successful. They're entrepreneurs, they're innovators, they're founders, all these things. They don't start out by saying, hey, I want to start a company. They start by creating something that's very personal. They don't do it for money. And most importantly, it's something that publicly demonstrates something about themselves. So these are things like I had, like writing a book. It's putting on a conference or an event series. It's releasing an audio album. It's doing those sorts of things. Those are really what matters. And so I started to realize, okay, well, maybe if I had this really unique experience of writing a book, maybe I just force all my students to write books. And so literally, that was the logic. Like there was no more like, hey, I should plan this thing. Like I literally told no one at the university because I was worried they would fire me. Well, I already told them.
You already quit.
Yeah, I already quit. But I was worried that like the dean would come down and like basically put the kibosh on this one. So I didn't tell anyone. But basically what I did is I went out and I interviewed a bunch of authors. And I said, all right, like, let me see how this thing is. And then this is a true story. I took my syllabus because I was like, I had a full-time job. I had a startup. Like I was a busy dude. And I like kind of hatched this thing kind of on a whim. I took my syllabus and I pushed Control F and I searched for the word startup and I replaced it everywhere with book. That was it. That was the whole thing. And I was like, listen, I'm just going to try to figure this thing out because why is a book any different than a startup? Why don't we try this thing? And that's what I did. And then I walked into class and I told all the students on the first day, all of you guys are going to write a book this semester. And they looked at me like I was legitimately insane, like truly like terror over their faces. And then, like time passed and then I was like, kept telling them more how this is going to work. And then I remember very vividly at a certain point, like I'm kind of talking and, I'm trying to be very like excited, lots of hand movements. And I remember a moment where the students all started pulling out their phones and I were like vigorously typing and these sorts of things and like kind of like looking around the room. And I thought to myself, I've connected with them. I've made it. They get it. This is important. They are excited. They're probably telling their friends and posting on social media how excited this whole thing is for them. No. I find out later they were seeing how many days left they had to drop the class. So,
that was gonna be my question. Yeah, like how many did you have students drop?
So funny thing you should say that. So first class of that one, I had, I think I had like 17 students that were in the class. Remember, this was an entrepreneurship class. The class was called Launching the Venture. This was that. And so it was weird how the schedule was. So I told them this, I did this whole thing. And I basically said like, trust me, I promise it's gonna be good. I'm not sure how it's gonna be good, but trust me, right? It's sort of what it was. And so then I had 10 days because it was this weird schedule thing before the next class met. And so you have no like feedback, right? No one emailed me or said anything. And so I showed up to class the 2 weeks, 10 days later thinking there might not be anyone here. The class more than doubled inside. 36 people showed up. They told their friends, they said how important this thing was. Yeah. And I realized like something, right? And what was interesting about it was a couple things. Like typically I had a very large population of white men. That was what it was. It became much more diverse, more women, more sort of minority students, people from not the business school. The whole thing shifted on its head. And that was sort of the moment where I was like, all right, like we may be onto something. I'm not sure this will work, but at that point I sort of realized at least there's something here and something different than everything else.
I remember when we first connected, the idea of, you had mentioned something that I had really found compelling was this idea that having a book as like a credibility or a credential by itself beyond a degree is so compelling, especially I'm sure to younger students today, just to have like that solidified expertise. Do you think that kind of maybe lent itself to why it exploded at the rate that it did?
Yeah, I mean,
diverse opinion.
For sure. I think the other thing I'll go back to again as an educator, and like I would tell you before, I really didn't know my students. I mean, and like to this know your customer, I just, it's nothing bad, but I just didn't. I think most of us don't truly know our customers very well in this case. And I think the interesting insight is that they feel sort of like disillusioned about the sort of whole higher education movement today. And what they were promised by their parents is not what they're getting today. Like they have ambitions to be, to be these people. They go to college because that's what they think that they're going to do, but they walk out of college with sort of two big problems. One is they literally are no closer to the career that they want, and they don't really have any prospects to figure that one out. That's sort of the first part about it, is like they were told you can be anything, right? And then yet here they are like, no, if they interview on campus and they have these sorts of things, then you can be that person. I think that's the first thing that they come out with. And the second problem that I think they come out with, and I think this is maybe a broader thing that we all sort of are seeing in more general here, is we see this bigger problem where they sort of don't have anything that differentiates them, right? I mean, there's 21 million college students today. 5 million college students will graduate, and you literally look no different, because on the employer side, I mean, being in startups and stuff like that, like I hire people all the time. I don't care where you went to school. I honestly don't. Like, in fact, it sometimes can be a negative. The more sort of prestigious the school you are, the more entitled and empowered you are. And so I think that those things are out there where people are sort of saying like, I have no specialty anymore. Like my major isn't what matters anymore. And I don't have any way to differentiate myself. And so what I think is starting to happen is you're seeing sort of savvy people look at these new credentials. And I think, I mean, I'm not anti-college by any means at all. I am anti the fact, though, that people believe that the better school you go into, the more likely you are to succeed in life. That is, nothing backs that up. The data doesn't back that up. The experience, the anecdotal experience doesn't back that up. It's the student, not the school, is entirely what everything says. That said, what the college admissions scandal this year has shown us is that parents still are pretty damn convinced that it's the school. And they're willing to do things that actually that go against their students' wishes, in fact, to push their kids into these things, guidance counselors, everything else. It comes back to ego, a lot of things. But I do think that, like, going back to your earlier question, I think the important thing today that we're seeing is that we should find a way for people to do something that's personal and that allows them to basically sort of like make something that's kind of customized to what they want to do. The illusion of like the major as your career path isn't true, right? It's not a real thing anymore.
Yeah. I'm not doing what I went to school for.
Either. Did you read Excellent Sheep? Because I just read that, and it's exactly, it talks about the whole college admissions thing and how it's so missing the mark right now.
Yeah.
But
and my problem with those books is that, like, everyone knows it, but nobody's doing anything about it, right? I mean, the problem is this, like, so let's just play this out, right? So we all know Excellent Sheep, people are sheep, they're going to these sorts of things, right? We've known this since the data came out in 2000. 2000, there was research that showed it doesn't matter what school you go to in terms of your own sort of success. But yet, over that time, applications to the Ivy League schools has gone up 4 times faster than the number of students. Like, what in the world are we thinking here? So my problem, and I think partially why I'm such like a big advocate that like we got to listen to these kids and give them a better shot, is that like we're telling them like, oh yeah, we know that these things matter, but yet we're acting in a very, very irrational way that I don't think actually helps them.
Definitely. They're not parallel like actions and words.
Yeah.
Hi all, we are super excited to offer an exclusive discount for our listeners to attend this year's EntreEd Forum, taking place on November 18th and 19th in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and experiential learning opportunities to help you ignite entrepreneurial thinking and integrate entrepreneurship into your learning communities. Use promo code EntreEd Talk to receive 5% off of every individual registration. Again, that's promo code EntreEd Talk. To learn more about the forum and register, visit www.entre-ed.org today and subscribe for updates as we launch new things happening every week as part of the planning for the forum. Thanks. See you there. So we did this in 3 weeks. We changed the class format, started writing books. Now you are a 2-time Entrepreneurship Professor of the Year. you made it through it, you decided to stay. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about like the experience of the first class and like how that's just rapidly grown to kind of be a model for this kind of space?
So before we do that one, I want to tell you that like the number of people who've tried to kill this, if I had $1 for every person who tried to kill this in the system, I would be a very wealthy man. I've been fired from 3 different, we'll call it fired, but I've been moved on from 3 different departments at Georgetown. I mean, this is like an amazing thing, right? I mean, it like nothing, again, not about me, but like, it's sort of crazy. Like this has been named the most innovative pedagogy of the year by USASB. Like I've gotten these big fancy awards for it. Mm-hmm. And yet the system has tried to kill this thing more times than I can count on it. So it's not one of those things. It's like, oh my God, Eric, you're amazing. Like we should make all our students do this one. No. Like this is something that I think people say, this isn't a good thing. And I'll tell you the reasons why this thing has been beat on, right? Like in these ways. Number one, going back to what I've said probably 14 times, ego, right? I have had people, and this is a true story. I've had people that have said to me, listen, we don't think this should happen because students shouldn't write books. And I was like, why do you think that? Faculty write books. This isn't fair. And I literally had someone tell me like, this isn't fair that you're helping students do it. Why can't you help us write books? We're struggling to get things published, which is like the most ridiculous thing you could ever hear, but it's true. And I think what's important to understand here is that like the doing these sorts of things are not necessarily like easy. And it wasn't just like, hey, this was an interesting idea, right? Like this is a great idea. And we figured out how to do it. And like, yeah, I mean, I've helped, more than 200 authors in the last 2 years publish. I've got, another 200 that'll publish this year, 60 different schools. I mean, like all of the cool trappings are here. That said, this doesn't fit within the educational model for a bunch of reasons, right? The first one of which is that like, it's a coached-based program that doesn't scale. So the reason we like education as the traditional educator sense is that we want to be able to have a really good teacher stand in front of a bunch of people and say great things and then have more and more students that we put into it because the economics of it make a lot of sense. And that's not just like, I'm not picking anyone, but that's just like the economics of what I call push-based learning. So push-based learning is where I have interesting things to tell you and you're supposed to listen to them and suddenly figure out where your life is. The opposite of it is what we call pull-based learning, which is like where you pull people towards where their goals is. It involves coaching, it involves like, iterative stuff like that. And so, when I go in to sort of say, hey, this is what it's going to take to help someone write this book, and I need coaches and I need editors and stuff like that. Like, but this doesn't fit into the way that we educate. This is like, for me, it takes 5 months, but that doesn't fit into a semester. I need, sort of editors to do this people, but we want to hire students as TAs. Like that doesn't so I think a lot of the things that are important to understand is that when you do things that are a little different, you sort of have to like keep twisting. And I think it's one of the things that is risky about, sort of our belief that disruptive education will happen within the system is that like the system is designed to like break those things, right? Like it's, it has white blood cells that attack the viruses. And so I think, I don't want to basically, you made the leap from you tried this crazy thing and then suddenly now like Eureka, you're magic. Like, yeah, it didn't play that way. It's been, and I would say it even this way. The fact that like we've continued to have to iterate on things like, I've tried to help get this happening at other schools. The reason this exists today is because I'm a stubborn son of a is period what it is, right? Like I realize like this is really powerful. And so I've sort of made the commitment to make it happen. But like, I teach an open version of this. That's what you and I talked about before a couple times a year, but I teach it as a volunteer endeavor because I believe in the mission. I teach it one of those things where I don't, I intentionally don't like sort of go out and say, hey, let me partner with school X or school Y. I find students that are really ambitious and are looking for something. And I say, listen, I'll help you, but like, we're just gonna have to do this sort of thing. And lastly speaking, like I've had to basically play around this sort of thing of like, I'm not an English professor. I'm not an English major. Like I don't, these things. And so oftentimes the thing is like, what do you know about teaching, writing books? And so, all of those sorts of things I think are why, and again, I'm not trying to say woe is me. I'm just saying that I think that there is an interesting thing when you try to do something that is, try to do the right thing, as other educators out there know, it doesn't always, like people don't throw you a parade, right? Like, and even though that it's working, they still don't throw me a parade, right? They still are like, but why? But why you? How? So I think there's a lot of things to be learned when you do something disruptive that like you just have to believe and like be willing to go to the mat for it.
Yeah, Toi, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of parallels between Doan's interview in this, because in our space where we're constantly in this, like we see why it's important, but when you look at it from a systems level, we see why there's tons of pushback, because exactly what you were saying. So I mean, I agree with everything.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm working on my dissertation, and I've been told that I'm confusing everybody. So maybe that's a good thing.
I mean, I think the bigger part of all of it, right, is that we think about what's going on in the world, is I think, if you really do step back and kind of what I think the goal of sort of being an educator is you want to like let people give people a path to be who they are destined to be. Like that's what it is. And so, you asked the question a little bit about like, what was for me, like the mission here is I realized like what I've built here in this sort of community, whatever this thing is, like I've built the world's best human accelerator. Like that's what it is. And so, the research that I've done is sort of to figure out like, all right, like what does it take to help someone who's, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old become successful, like to be them best selves. And so I actually went out and studied all of the Forbes 30 under 30. And part of the reason I picked that list was because my students want to be on it, right? So let's just start there, right? Like, and let's stop assuming who they want to be, but that's the place they tell me time and time again that they want to be on, the most ambitious students. And so, and again, people will take issue with the list. I don't care about the list. I just care that they care about the list. So start there. So then let's look and sort of say, if that's what they want to be, how do we accelerate them there? Well, so a couple of thoughts that I looked at. I was like, all right, like, let me see like where those people went to school. So the big theory of like, go to a great school. Again, there's about 5,000 people on this list for the last like 7 years or so. Top 10 schools, right? Everyone said, go to the top 10 schools. That'll set you up for success early on. Less than 16% of that list went to a top 10 school, right? So that wasn't it. And the people that were on that list are probably people who, no matter what school they went to, still would have made the list, right? So it wasn't the school they went to. Second thing, I was like, okay, well, maybe the theory that I oftentimes am told is like, yeah, kids go to undergrad, but then they got to go to a better graduate school. So law school, even worse wrong on that one. Like there's more people on this list who dropped out of college or never went than went to graduate school. So that's not it either, right? So then the third one, I was like, well, maybe it's that they're founders. They're starting companies in college. That's the thing. They started companies later. Like they were after college for the vast majority of them. So the key thing that I found though, is that they all had something fairly common. This idea that I told you about a creation event. Most of them, while they were in college, did something that was substantive that they created. Number one, they had this sort of creation event. They created a book, a podcast season, a video show, whatever it was. And number two, they developed a mentor-like relationship with a faculty member. They were coached. They didn't sit there and learn. Like that's the thing that's key about it. So they did something hard and meaningful and substantive, and they had a mentor-like relationship. So I think as we think a lot about like what we're trying to do and like why this works, because that's it, right? Like you help people do those things, that leads them to where they want to go. And I think that's kind of why, as I think about what I'm trying to do, I don't like try to create entrepreneurs today, but like over time, if I set people up for success, they'll do interesting and innovative things, but who knows whether that's starting a company or not.
I actually really love the term creation event. I feel like we work heavily in K-12. So we're not, I'm not even going to pretend to understand the dynamics of higher ed at all. But at K-12, we really are pushing for giving those students the opportunity to have those experiences where they figure out passions so that they don't get to higher ed and just sit there and basically become an empty vacuum vessel for knowledge to be put into them. So I really like that. I love that your research is focused on that. That's interesting. Toi, you're probably getting some ideas.
I'm so excited. Something that I read, and I really hope that you talk more about the Creator Institute, but something that I read on your website was about how the millennial workforce is, even as not as their own entrepreneur, as starting a business or being their own company, but they want that innovation and creativity in their workplace. And so how that's changing and how that's possible to happen. I think it's called the startup career. That and I hoping you could dive a little more into that about how.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. My internet flipped on me.
No, you're okay.
Sorry.
But how the workplace is changing and how you can have that, like you said earlier, you can have that and not necessarily have your own company at the same time, or a hybrid of those two things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to what we talked about before. I think people really are craving autonomy, and the way that they get that autonomy is different, right? Like, I mean, you know, even if you go to your job and you feel like you can talk to your boss about a project you want to work on, that's autonomy, right? That's great. I just think there's this binary thing of like, you're either starting companies or you're not. And, you know, I think there's a lot of power in this idea here of a little bit of like remembering that, like, when young people today, high school, college, whatever it is, when they talk about what they want to be when they grow up, they're not necessarily interested in being like an entrepreneur in like the high growth entrepreneur sense of the words, but they are looking for these ways to have control, whether that's, you know, what they do for fun or what they do for, you know, at work. I think that's a big thing that I've seen a lot about.
We see that in the K through 12 space a lot. That's why, but we see a lot of people stumble over the word entrepreneurship. Yeah. Because that's the first thing, especially in education. That's the first you think, you go immediately to having this, you know, brick and mortar business, or having this, you know, and it's such much more of a broad definition now.
Yeah.
Because I was $2.99 and a web host, I have a business, right? Yeah. and I just need to build it. So that's I think a really neat shift, and something we always fight against, explaining to schools and powers that be and stakeholders in our space sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm curious about so the Creator Institute is kind of your open source of your program. Yep. And walking anybody through the book process. Have you found that there's like when the people sign up for it, do they have a different opinion of what it is versus when they get into the program itself being such a really entrepreneurial process? Mm-hmm. Do you think there's like a difference between what they think, like drafting a book and publishing a book as versus what they experience?
For sure. I mean, you know, I think, you know, one of the big things that I, you know, how I built this program was by interviewing all these authors. And I asked them, like, you know, tell me, what did you do differently on your second book than your first book? It kind of this idea of like trying to, because I think, you know, the stats are not very good, right? 2% of people that start a book ever finish, right? Like 81% of people want to write a book, but like if you start one, the odds are really stacked against you pretty heavily. And so I had written two, and I remember that insight being like, wow, the first one was really hard to do. The second one I finished in a pretty rapid time afterwards. I mean, I published 2 books in about like 18 months, which is really unusual when you write a big, you know, 600 plus page book. But so I thought that was an interesting insight. And so I was like, well, let me validate that one. And so I went on and interviewed all these authors, and I focused on second time authors, like multiple time authors. And I said, what did you do differently? And it was this like cathartic moment for them. Like, oh my God, let me tell you all these things. And I think that's what I learned, is that like, there's this idea of what it means to write a book in our heads. That world though, it's isolated, you know, it's all this work, and, you know, it's these things that you sort of have to have a great idea and go through it. The reality is it's not that, right? I mean, like the, you know, serial time authors, they have a community of other book writers. They're like writing together. They have these structures and deadlines. They use templates from the first book that they did. They hire an editor earlier. They have a coach. So I think that the thing, I mean, you know, I try and basically make sure that people, like, I guess I would say, if I gave everyone all the details of what's unique about it, I would overwhelm them and they may like cry and never do it. But I try to give people to sort of say, like, the secret of writing a book is remembering you're not going to do it alone. And if you give people that framework behind it, I think that will work. And I think that's the sort of the secret of all these sorts of things, is that in kind of coach-based learning, or sort of pull-based learning rather than push-based learning, it is about sort of making sure that you are offering kind of just-in-timeness of this whole thing. I mean, I use a platform that allows people to chat with me, message with me. Professors and, you know, student or like, you know, teachers think that's nuts. Like, how would you do that? Why would you respond to people? Like, give them the information, let them figure it out. Well, that's not how it works, right? Like, I mean, yeah. I had a student tell me this, and it was really eye-opening for me. I thought to myself, I was like, this probably encapsulates the whole world of, you know, my experience in a nutshell. Is they said, listen, Eric, I love your classes and your lectures. Like, they're really great and helpful, but I would trade 10 hours of lectures for 15 minutes of a conversation with you. And I thought to myself, like, that's really interesting. And when I was trying to frame out how this class would have to happen, I was like, listen, I need to talk to all my students a couple times for 15 minutes. They're like, but why? I was like, don't you think that's okay to talk to all of them? Like, and I think that's kind of the interesting mindset here, is that coach-based learning is really different, right? It kind of requires you to think differently and remember that you need to be responsive to the challenge they're having. kind of in this broader thing. And that's why I think a book really works well. It's this, the 5-month journey it's structured in terms of like, we all start at the same place with an idea and some of the direction, and we have an endpoint in mind. We all want to get everyone to a mediocre first draft, but the journey itself is different for every person, right? Like some people will sort of struggle and, churn around and stuff like that. And then, a month before it's due, they'll crank out, 30,000 words and it's great, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other people will chip away at every week. It just sort of depends. But I think it's about giving people sort of a goal to get through all the resources they need to do it, but know that like not everyone's going to like chip away at the same process every week.
Yeah, that's powerful in itself, the autonomy to figure that out. So, that buzzword again.
There you go.
Which is wildly different than the systems that we currently have. So that's really compelling. If you could give any advice to an educator, maybe even dipping down into the high school, middle school arena, to sort of set students up for success in this way, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I'll start here. I mean, some people ask me like, well, could this work in other places? Does it work? I mean, I've taught probably a dozen or 24 high school students through this process, people who are freshmen. I mean, I'm doing a program this summer at Georgetown where we're going to test sort of like take about 40 or 50 high school students through a version of this one. So anyone listening that they have an ambitious student, like I'd be happy to sort of like, help them and help these people do it. I honestly think that the biggest thing that you just sort of have to do when you're thinking about this sort of anything is really understand like what your students' sort of ambitions are, their goals are, and then build constraints around that. I think the key thing to understand here is that, generally speaking, education is set up around credentialing, right? Like that's kind of what we're trying to do. You gather this credential, you get this high school diploma, you get this degree, you get this thing in that way. And so I think that like, if you sort of just assume that you're participating in the system as it is, like understand that that's the system the way it is. And that was sort of an eye-opening thing for me as I thought to myself that like, this was all about learning and classes and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that like people want to teach their students, but the system itself is predicated on credentialing. Like we want people to go through the system so that we can say, this person is a high school graduate, this person is a college graduate, we have that thing. So that's the system, that's how it is. And so I think as an educator, what I've had to realize in that sort of way is you just have to recognize that's pushing against you. And you have to figure out something that I would tell people is like, can you try and accomplish something so that at the end of the class, the semester, the program, there is something that's created that your student can put in their portfolio. And so I think that's the world that we're seeing today, is that there is this idea a lot around you are collecting your credentials and you're defined by them. So I am a, blah, blah, blah graduate. I am a blah, 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 employee and that sort of stuff. And we define ourselves, in some ways I call it, we borrow credibility from other people. And so we're defined by the groups that have accepted us or let us go through that sort of thing. I think that's the way that the world has historically worked. It's easy. It makes a lot of sense. Like that's what's happened. I think the other side is what I would describe as creating credibility. And what that comes from is putting things in your portfolio that define you, that are really yours, right? Like I am a graduate of X school, doesn't say anything about me other than that, like I was good enough to get in there and make it through, right? It doesn't like actually do anything individual. I think on the flip side of it, what we're talking about is these sort of created credibility are the things that define you. These are things that like, I can read the book you wrote. I can listen to the podcast you created. I can do these sorts of things. And I think that's sort of the flip on it. So I would just sort of, I think from a mindset standpoint, I would sort of recognize as educators that 99.9% of education today is driven around these theories of credentialing. And again, that's not bad. That's just the system that we have. I think if you want to start to play in the world that I think will start to emerge more and more, because that's what our students are demanding, it's this idea of portfolio, right? This idea of this portfolio of experiences and creations that you do, this created credibility. And so that would be my sense, is like just step back and say, all right, when my students walk out of this class, do they have something, I always joke this way, does something come out of your class that you're proud enough that their parents would put it on the refrigerator, right? And like, it's a simple idea, right? But like, I have daughters that are young, 5, 3, and 7 months. We put stuff on the refrigerator. Why do we stop doing that when they're teenagers and they're in college and they're in grad school? Like, why don't we have things that they've created that we're proud enough of them we would put on our refrigerator? I think that's the world that we need to go back to, is like figure out to do something you're proud of.
Definitely. And that reminds me so much. There's a lot of growing movement in the idea of like a personal brand starting all the way down. It's tied very into that. Like
I will say this. I hate the word personal brand.
I'm sure I was like, I know he's going to hate this buzzword.
This buzzword I hate. So I'll tell it this way. And here's why I hate it is like, I just think that like brand sort of means this thing that you can go out and like sort of fix sort of these sorts of things. You can put like logo packaging on it. Yeah. I want people to elevate their voice. I want them to sort of amplify their voice so people listen to you. Like a brand is something people buy. Voice is what I think. Sheryl Sandberg is the one that talks about this one. She's like, I'm not a brand. I'm just not. Like, you can't package me in that way. But I do have a voice. And if you do things that elevate that one, great. That's what I care about. So yeah, I do not love the personal branding movement because it's sort of like, it dumbs it down into, is your LinkedIn profile active enough? If you have this blah, 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 like, versus like, do people actually care? And that's the bigger thing. Do you have a voice that people will listen to?
Yeah, and the authenticity of what you're creating as a personal brand because of what you think people want it to look like versus what it is. So we are running low on time. I do have one final question that I want to know your critique of podcasts.
Yeah. Because
we said we were going to dive into this.
Yes.
So let me hear.
I will tell you the critique of podcasts. And this is nothing against, I mean, I have a podcast. I do it and stuff like that.
We're not podcast haters here on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm not a hater of it per se. My ambition behind what I'm trying to do is create a new type of educational sort of platform for people. And in that platform, I believe, and you want to create things that have value. Here's the problem. If this content isn't valuable enough that you would sell for it, is it actually valuable? So my critique of the podcasting movement is it's the same movement. We had the same movement about 15 years ago with blogs, and everyone created a blog and everyone had this free content out there and everyone sort of is giving away this stuff for free. So when people come to me asking about podcasts, and I actually am doing a program on this this spring with a group of authors, I tell them, listen, I don't teach a podcasting class, but I will help you create an audio show that is valuable enough that you could charge for it. And if we can't do that one, then don't do it. But I believe sort of now my core is there's a difference between being a content creator and a content entrepreneur. And the content entrepreneurs are people that believe the value they're creating is valuable enough that they would sell for it. So what I would share in my way is like, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, I should create a podcast. It costs money to do it. And you're giving it all away for free on this theory that like it's going to sort of pay itself back. Flip that whole thing around. Why don't you go out and create something that's valuable enough that you could package up and sell episodes of it on Amazon or sell it on Spotify in that way? So my critique of these movements a little bit is I think that why are we asking content creators to give it away for free? Why? Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I totally understand it, but that's one of the things that I've sort of realized is like, especially as, you know, we're helping people become entrepreneurs, but yet we're telling them, give it all away for free. It's not valuable. And so that's sort of my critique of the podcasting rush to it. And so, you know, like I have a group of sort of individual came to me who said, hey, listen, Eric, we want to do a podcast. And I was like, I won't help you do that one, but I will help you. I think the content you have is super duper interesting. Let's turn it into a show that you would be willing to sell. And they're like, suddenly what flipped in their heads is they saw themselves as valuable versus it's like it's a privilege for them to put this stuff out there for free. Now, I think podcasting is great and that like you can take that content and share it out there and open these things. But I think at the core of it, it's like a mindset shift. There's a reason that I do books. Like people ask me, hey, could I take your class as a blogging class? And I was like, no, because like that implies that the content that you're going to spend a year working on is so unvaluable that you would just give it away for free. Now, I get people will have these things about like, hey, but I want to build my brand, stuff like that. Yeah, great. Like put the book out there, put a $16.99 price tag on it, and then give it all away for free. But at least what people know is that you're not giving away for free. You're giving them $16 of value in a way that's free in that way. So that's my critique of podcasting. We're just seeing the same thing that happened with blogs, you know, sort of a decade and a half ago. And again, I'm not critiquing you guys. I'm doing the same thing. But I think that as I start to teach it, and again, more and more students are coming to me saying, hey, Eric, I know you do books. I want to do a podcast. My answer is like, let's turn that into a video show or audio show. Or, someone's like, hey, I want to do a YouTube channel. Great. Why don't we actually create like a video course for you and then sell that? And then you can syndicate it, some of the pieces on YouTube in that way. But I think there's like the difference between a content creator and a content entrepreneur is you create content that's valuable enough that people will pay you for it.
That's a super interesting perspective that I hadn't really thought about. That's interesting.
Nearly no one has. I mean, like, right?
Well,
because like,
yeah,
we think about creating podcasts because it's like this, brand building exercise. It's valuable. It like helps uplift us. But again, really back to the same question though, is like, is it valuable? Like, what price are you putting on it if you're giving it away for free? And on the flip side of it, if someone's going to listen to it, like, okay, like how great is this one if you're willing to give it away for free? And again, I'm not picking on you, just the general.
Yeah, no,
in that
I'm
way.
not offended.
My wheels are turning right now.
I would tell you, if I were to give you some feedback on this one, right, I would say, how can you go out and take all these amazing things and package them up into something that could be that's sellable, right? And because I think that like there is some amazing content behind it, but it's sort of like, I think that if you don't deem it to be valuable enough, like you've not packaged it up in a way that you can ascribe value to it, then you're leaving it on the table. And again, I just would always tell people there's this hesitancy about charging for things.
Yeah.
Like charge for things, like put it out there. And if no one says yes to it, then it probably means it's not that valuable then, right? Like there's all these sorts of things. We teach this in entrepreneurship. And again, that's kind of the movement that I'm trying to really center on.
The last question we have is typically, how can people connect with you to learn more? So if you wanted to just share any social outlets, your website, however you want people to connect with you, would be great.
Yeah. So I guess the big thing I would say is I am sort of committed to this idea of helping create 10,000 authors in the next 10 years. That's kind of my mission today. So there's two ways that I would sort of say, like, if you've always wanted to write a book, 3 times a year, Georgetown lets me run this open book community. So that's kind of what I do 3 times a year. So I'm, you can find me wherever it is. Like I'm on LinkedIn, the website is creator.institute. That's just the website. But what I would tell you too, specifically for your audience, is I also believe that we won't get to 10,000 authors by me having to teach 10,000 people. So one of the big things that I'm doing this semester is I started coaching and working with a group of professors in college, but as well, I'd love to work with people in high school. And the idea behind it is this: you can only teach this if you've done it. And so you can only teach people how to write a book if you've already done it once. So write a book, but let's go through it with a mindset of like how you would teach this one. And I think what I've sort of started to realize is this program in class that I've done, it's an awesome textbook. It will serve that way. But if you want to take a group of 5 students at your campus through it, great. Let's plug them into the textbook. And then you help do some of the coaching in your community to help them succeed. So that's kind of where I'm sort of committed to for the next phase of it, is I've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out how to make this thing work. And I've learned that like the teaching part of it and the like logistical part of it is challenging. But the thing that you can't replace is the coaching element that comes from, a professor, a teacher. And so like, what I've been seeing here is that there's like, some groups of high school students who have a professor who's sort of coaching the group of 3 or 4 authors through this process. They plug into this community we have, and they go through the process with the support of someone local. So that would be my suggestion, is if anyone's interested in writing a book and supporting other students through it, like I'm in, I'll do it. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity to help students do this sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Yeah, we'll definitely share that with our network. I think there are probably a lot of teachers that are interested in that space and just hadn't thought that way. So yeah. Appreciate your time tremendously. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.